Hey guys, welcome to another video on parts of speech, and today we're going to be dealing with verbs. Verbs are quite complex in that there's so many different components to verbs, and we'll be doing this video in a few parts. So this is part one, and we're going to be dealing with just person, okay? So for example, number and singular plural. So person and number is our first part of the verbs. Next time we're going to be dealing with verb tenses, but the reason why I wanted to do person and number first is because this is probably one of the most complex or misunderstood components of verbs. Primarily because when I say what person is this or what number is this, I get a lot of confused faces in the classroom going, what do you mean by that? Okay, so every single language works pretty much the same way in that every verb is dependent on some type of subject, and that subject could be a singular subject or a plural subject. But before I write that down, I just want to let you guys know verbs are action. Okay, they're action words. They're words that are going to have some type of feeling of action. Like, for example, a holding is one thing. And then we have something else called mobile verbs or verbs of motion, where if you're running or walking, there's a completely different set of rules for that. We call these transitive and intransitive verbs. Okay, so transitive, intransitive. If you think about the word transit, right? To go across something, right? To transverse. Pretty much any transitive verb is a verb that will transition, hence transitive, from the subject to the direct object. Okay. In other words, most of these verbs are going to be active verbs, right? And intransitive could also be active, but transitive verbs will take on some form of direct object. Intransitive verbs are verbs that do not transition. Okay, so do not transition from subject to direct object. Okay, and these verbs are all the time, and I'm going to put this here, they're verbs of motion. Okay, so every time you see a verb that deals with some kind of motion, like running, even standing can be a verb of motion. Those will not take a direct object. It usually will take some type of preposition. So walking to the store, you can only affect something indirectly if you're using a verb of motion. Running to the store as opposed to running a store are two completely different meanings. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to kind of get through to you guys, that verbs come in both transitive and intransitive parts. And usually some dictionaries like the Oxford and the Cambridge Dictionary will tell you that this verb is transitive or this verb is intransitive. Now, does this work for all languages? Typically, especially in Romance languages, they work exactly the same way. Remember that English is derived from Latin and Greek. Of course, there's Celtic and some Gaelic and some Germanic, but mostly the grammar is established throughout the Romance languages. Even though English is not necessarily included in that, it still derives most of its influence from the same type of structure, grammatical structure. So getting back to person and number. So let's start with the easiest, and that is number. Okay. So number is pretty much how many. Okay. Remember that a verb is, and I'll put this down over here, big asterisk. Verb is dependent on the subject. And I'm going to say always, right? And you can challenge me on that if you'd like. You can see if you can find some other examples where that's not the case. So, for example, if I'm going to say to walk, okay, to walk is pretty much an infinitive. Now you could use that as a subject, okay? You can turn a verb into a subject, but we'll get into that when we talk about participles. And you can also have infinitive subjects, like to be or not to be. But in essence, if I say drive, okay? If I say drive, it really makes no sense unless I add a subject. I drive, okay? Therefore, verbs are always dependent on the subject, and we need to know whether that subject is going to be a singular subject or a plural subject. Now, why is this important? This is important, so important to know how many, because the verb changes. So it changes form. Like, for example, I walk, but he walks. Notice that I add an S at the end of the walk to indicate the change between a singular and a plural. Now, English is very simple because the only time you're going to see a change in the verb is when we're talking about third person singulars versus first or second person singulars. That S is going to be there. Whereas in other languages, Italian, Spanish, French, Latin, Greek, you name Romanian, and even other languages like Arabic, you will see that the verb will change form every single time you change the person. So if it's first person singular, there's one ending to the verb. If it's second person singular, there's another ending. So many of you guys have spent tons and tons of time in French class learning how to conjugate the ER verb or the IR verb or the RE verb. Those are because from the Romance languages like Latin and Greek, endings determined which person you were talking about. Okay, so in Latin, I don't have to say that I drive. I can simply say ago. Okay, if I say ago, a Roman would understand perfectly that I drive. Okay, versus in English, we need that subject to be put in there. So the change of verbs, and maybe I'll put that down here. So the change of verbs forms is called a conjugation, which literally means to join together. Coniungo, from Latin coniungo. Now, why do we call it a conjugation and joining together? Because in that example that I just gave you, I drive and he drives, we are literally joining together an S to the rest of the word, hence conjugation. So the changes of nouns is called a declension. The change of verbs or verb forms is called a conjugation. So numbers, we have singular and plural. Okay, so singular and plural verbs, because they are dependent on the subject, remember that, and I'm going to put this in caps because this is extremely important. Okay, verbs must agree with their subjects. Example, okay? Again, let's go with that I drive. I drive, okay, is good. He drive is not good. Okay, notice that right here, this does not agree with the subject, and that is why it sounds weird, because you need to put he drives. And there is that S, and I'm going to put it in the color right there for you. There's that S that is conjoined with the rest of the word, and now it makes perfect sense. So remember, verbs must agree with their subjects. That is why the verbs are dependent on the subject, always. All right, moving on to moving on to person. Okay. So person answers the question who. Okay, so this is important to know because we need to know the subject. Okay, so if I'm going to talk about myself, I'm going to be using a lot of I's. If you're going to be talking about a friend, you'll be using to somebody else, you'll be doing a lot of you's, right? If you're going to talk about your friend, you're going to say you. But if you're going to talk about your friend to somebody else, you're going to be using a lot of he or she. So very important that you need to know who the person is you are actually talking about. And that verb is going to reflect that. So we have first person, second person, third person. Okay, and they are all the same in both singular and plural. So we got singular, and then I can copy and paste this and make it plural right here at the bottom. So if I'm talking about first person, I always mean I. Okay, that is pretty much it. I is the first person singular always. And if we add the verb drive, it agrees with my subject, which is first person singular. Second person singular is always you. And the verb will be the same. Notice that it did not change. In French, it would have already changed. In every other language, it would have already changed. But in English, we keep it the same. And then he, she, or it, which is third person singular. And this is where we see the change once again, drives, okay? First person plural is we. And same thing, drive. Second person plural. And again, English is so ambiguous. And by ambiguous, I mean there's so many double meanings in it that here's an example where you looks exactly the same like second person singular. And it's going to conjugate exactly the same as the second person singular, but context will usually determine what you mean by you. In the States, they say y'all, or you could say you all, or all of you, okay? So there are some other options that you could use to really tell your reader or somebody who's listening how many yous you are saying. Third person, they. And same thing, drive. Okay, so notice that the only time we see a change in the ending of the verb in the English language is third person singular, okay? So I'm hoping that you now have a little bit better understanding of what we mean by person and number. Just to recap, we need to know a number because we need to know how many people or things we are dealing with. We need to know the person because we need to know who we are dealing with. Okay, and that will determine, as you can see by this conjugation chart, how the verb is going to change. Hopefully this will not only help you with your English, but also could help you with your French. If you're kind of scratching your head and wondering, why do I have to memorize all these endings in French? It's because French is very, very particular and shows you in its ending exactly how many people and who is the subject that we care about. And again, there's no ambiguities in French. There is really no ambiguities in Italian, Spanish, Romanian, Latin, or Greek, because when it comes to this particular thing, the conjugation of the verb, because you know exactly how many people and what it is based on the ending of the verb. And last but not least, don't forget about the transitive and intransitive verbs. Transitive, transit from the subject to the direct object, and intransitive verbs will not transition from the subject to the direct object. They will usually affect something indirectly, like verbs of motion. Well, I hope this was helpful for you guys. This was part 1 of verbs. Next, we will be dealing with tenses, verb tenses, how many tenses there are in the English language. Thank you guys so much for watching. And again, save this for yourself. Go back to it. If you're having difficulty understanding different parts of grammar, different parts of speech, there is a video for you right here. Go back to it, recount it, and I hope this is going to be helpful for you guys going forward. Take care. Bye-bye.